Today we are happy to present two professors from the University of San Diego, John Bilsel and Juliana Maxim. They're husband and wife, and they've been in San Diego for 16 years. John is from Turkey, and Juliana is from Romania and Canada. And John was the one who started the program at the University of San Diego, the architecture program, which Juliana now runs, and he's a professor. And the reason why they're here today is because they're working on a book called Architecture and the Housing Question, which is a big question in San Diego, of course. And they have 15 contributors to this book that's coming out in about a year, and they're going to go over the book's contents and what they learned about it and give us some thoughts, I guess, on what it all means. So, who wants to go first? And then afterwards, I'm sure they'll take questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think I did. Do you hear me? Yes? No? So I think it's on. It's on. It's on. Okay, let's do that. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with the Friends of San Diego Architecture. And I'm so impressed that you all woke up this early for a lecture. So I hope we'll not be disappointing you this morning. We titled this talk, Architecture and the Housing Question, a book in progress. All we can offer you at the moment is a glimpse of a new history of architecture and the housing question, which we are co-editing and which will feature the work of 15 scholars from around the world. Our own interest in the history of the housing question is related to our previous research, especially Juliana's book research, actually her book, The Socialist Life of Modern Architecture, Bucharest 1949-64, will be forthcoming this year. So I am relatively a latecomer to the housing question, but it is also basically this topic is linked to our teaching at the University of San Diego's still new architecture program, together with my colleagues Daniel Lopez Perez, Adriana Cuellar, Shannon Starkey, who's here, and most recently Erin Jones and Alex Mayment. So when we were starting this program, we wanted it to address the lasting questions of the discipline, but it is also situated in this specific place in the world. So as architecture professors, we use San Diego, Tijuana as an urban laboratory, directing our students to conduct mapping and urban typological analysis. Actually, some of them are so interested, apparently, that they even show up on a morning. That, I'm impressed about that. And so basically, housing research and design have come to occupy a really important place in our curriculum. But there was also another component to our program for a number of years. We took our students to summer research workshops in Istanbul, Turkey, where our attention quickly turned to that city's massive, but truly massive, housing developments and urban transformations. By 2015, we were ready to reach out to a greater audience. We organized and housed a conference here in San Diego. The book project grew out of these discussions and then grew to include other scholars whom we believe are among the key contributors to this field. So the problem that we wish to address in this book, in just few words, is the often assumed and rarely questioned congruence of modern housing with a political project or ideology. This is a relation that has persisted, if evolved, throughout modernity.
So does this work? Yeah. Okay. I want to go over perhaps the theoretical grounds of the project. Talk a bit about the title and some of the words that appear in the title, such as housing, for instance. In the 19th century, you see an image on the screen, the English word housing referred to an impoverished collectivity whose membership was actually delineated in law, in British law, as the working classes. So if the peasant or the landlord lived in houses, the newly urbanized workers, such as the ones that you see on the screen, lived in housing. So this is a distinction that is still very much with us today. We still operate with categories such as mass housing for a certain type of population and real estate for the rest. So these terms signal already these kind of vectors of segregation. So unlike a house, which we understand as the work of an architect serving a sometimes wealthy patron, or the house as the responsibility of the inhabitant, as a private citizen, the anchor of the family over many generations, housing, on the other hand, posed a difficult question, and still continues to pose a difficult question in the sense that it has moral and political implications. So in the 19th century as today. How, for instance, if at all, should the government intervene in the lives and property of private individuals in order to improve the living conditions and the moral character? Is there an issue with the mic? Sort of. It comes and goes. So, should the government, if at all, intervene in these questions? Who should pay for it, for instance? So from the outset, the modern idea of housing belonged much more with the government of men and of things than with the art of building. So the title itself, we borrowed from Frederick Engels, and I really want to introduce him here, who published a series of newspaper articles almost 150 years ago in 1870s under the title The Housing Question. So Engels was a very interesting person. He was a radical thinker, an atheist, a political theorist. He's perhaps most famous because he co-authored with Karl Marx the Communist Manifesto. But he was also the son of a capitalist industrialist, very wealthy German industrialist, who sent the young Engels to England, more specifically to Manchester, to work for the family business, which was a large textile factory. Manchester at the time was also ground zero of Europe's industrialization. And there, Engels, the young Engels, observed firsthand its consequences. That is, these social and physical consequences of child labor, the despoiling of the environment, the overworked and impoverished workers, so these problems that are still very much present and acute today, though perhaps displaced to other locales. Much like today, a debate then was raging about how to help the urban poor, which was this new and growing class of people. And in the housing question, Engels critiqued in very forceful terms the two main approaches to housing at the time. On one hand, there was a kind of utopian socialism, and on the other hand, philanthropy. So there's on one hand the socialists, such as the French philosopher Charles Fourier, you might have heard of his phalanstère, proposed self-contained communities where work would be done for the mutual benefit, and where forms of exploitation of women, for instance, Fourier was the first to coin the word feminism. So these kinds of exploitations would be erased. So the solution for the socialists was to build these alternative communities and where the good life would be obtained by removing oneself from the industrial city. So this is of course sort of grandfather of the hippie commune, if you want, a sort of caricature. So these were the socialists. On the other hand, the philanthropists, which again is something that's very much still with us, the rich would give to the poor to alleviate their suffering out of moral and religious duty. By the 1870s, when Engels was writing, philanthropy as a movement had gained a lot of traction in England, enough to pass housing legislation in Parliament. But Engels pointed out quite poignantly how steeped in moralism and ideology this philanthropy was, in the sense that it came, so housing would be provided to the poor, but it also came with the expectations of piety, sobriety. You couldn't drink, you had to marry, so there was really social norms that were enforced alongside with housing. Engels argued that either of these solutions mistook a symptom for a disease. So according to him, the problem was not a lack of acceptable housing. The problem was with a... Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. The problem, according to Hegel, was with a society that depended on the exploitative nature of wage labor. What the members of the proletariat, the workers, needed was not access to housing, but awareness of the root causes of their misery, that is, the greater system, by definition unjust, of industrial capitalism. So on the screen are some very early examples of tenement housing that housed in Paris and in England these kind of urban working poor. So they were considered at the time sanitary and affordable. And according to Engels, these kinds of projects were a small price to pay for the bourgeoisie to maintain its grip on power. Engels contended that both philanthropy and utopian socialism would simply produce mortgage-carrying homeowners out of the proletariat, which is introducing yet another form of oppression. This is an example of one of those early projects that included this sort of both an urban planning dimension and the provision of housing. So Engels was highly skeptical of early experiments such as these with modern architecture. And the architect's assumption that intervening in the built environment would engineer a better society. According to him, public or social housing projects had no place in history. In fact, there were delays in the course of history. Providing workers with acceptable housing was simply a distraction from the real issue of class struggle and only ensured the continuation of conditions of exploitation. When the revolution would finally arrive, and Engels was convinced that it would arrive, the housing shortage would simply be solved as a consequence of the redistribution of wealth. So for Engels, and that's important, it's a sort of open challenge to architects, for Engels, the solution to housing is definitely not architecture. So at the other extreme, so if Engels represents one pole that says that architecture is ultimately inefficient, right, a kind of almost like a red herring, at the other extreme of this debate stands the modern architect and it's mostly a he, his ally throughout the 20th century, the modern state. So in the US, we don't talk about the state, we talk about the government, but we're really talking about similar entities. So modern architects, far from sharing Engels' skepticism about architecture's role in contributing to a more just society, The states embraced affordable housing as a social project of massive proportions. We're going to show you some examples today. The idea of welfare, that is a modern system of mutual solidarity, substituted throughout the 20th century the older idea of social philanthropy. And these large housing projects proliferated in North America and especially in European cities. So here is a comparison between an early German project and a 1960s project from a socialist state. The book for us is really a way to look at this intersection between social and political reform. So, the moment when the social and political reform looks at architecture, and vice versa, when architecture reveals or assumes social, political, and political agenda. So, moments when each finds itself in the ambitions of the other. So bringing up Engels' spirit today means that our point of departure is to revive the link, which is not always, it's essential but not always fully understood, between architectural project and the political one. Even when we seem to be dealing with strictly technical housing solutions, what are the cultural and political assumptions underlying these practices in US and abroad? How can housing become a question of publicly negotiated cultural values? So in other words, we're not merely engaging in a historical survey of housing solutions, but we really want to revisit how certain historical moments framed the question of housing, at once from the point of view of the architectural profession and from outside it. Okay. Well.
I won't tell you what this is. You all know it, right? The post-war experiments with housing were colored by the politics of Cold War, when competing models were understood as emblems of the political regimes that sanctioned them. Clear boundaries were drawn between public housing in Western European welfare states and the suburban subdivisions under American-style laissez-faire capitalism, of course, notwithstanding the significant achievements of public housing in the United States. So, in other words, the scholarship especially established this very clear distinction between, say, American-style post-war housing, and on the other hand, social housing in Western democracies such as France, and the socialist housing of the totalitarian regimes behind the so-called Iron Curtain. The construction of subsidized housing reached an unprecedented scale during the post-war years. If you take, for example, the United Kingdom, public housing amounted to more than half of the newly constructed dwellings during this time. In Scotland, this ratio reached 85%, meaning during the post-war period in Scotland, 85% of all housing built was public housing. So here, basically, two of our contributing authors to our book, they are presenting very different positions, and as editors, we are a bit thinking about how we are going to reconcile that, if at all we are going to reconcile it. So on one hand, in Pillars of the Welfare State, post-war mass housing in Belgium and the Netherlands, the Scottish professor Miles Glendinning examines two seemingly similar corporatist welfare state regimes in Europe, Belgium on one hand and the Netherlands on the other. From the outside, to us, they may appear very similar. Both countries are pillarized societies, meaning vertically organized by two ethnic and religious groups like Catholics and Protestants, or like Flanders or French speakers. He demonstrates that even in these two countries that we often think of as very similar, there was no one welfare housing, and that the course of social housing policy and architecture could flow in sharply different directions. So that's kind of interesting because you might have known about Professor Glandering. He is very well known author. But then basically, I would say that he is a neo-historicist in the sense that when he looks at two welfare housing programs in two neighboring countries, all he sees is differences. He would refuse to just like put them together into like a category called welfare. On the other hand, there is Kimberly Zarekor, American historian of Czechoslovakia. So in contrast, she seeks, in her contribution to our book, structural similarities on two sides of the Cold War. She is interested in the underlying and comparable formulations of suburbanization and good life in places as distinct as post-war United States and Czechoslovakia. Okay, but let's continue a bit our overview of what was happening in the post-war. So, of course, there is France pursuing a planned market economy. The three post-war decades, France built a staggering number of HLMs, or rent control housing, in the grands ensembles or modernist new towns in the periphery of Paris. So today, as those of you who've been there know, about 70% of the Parisians live not in the Paris, but in basically housing districts. Okay, so let me show you quickly some of the images of the post-war housing in France from the glorious 30 years, as they call it. So Sarcelles. It's true, it's called Les 30 Glorieuses, which is the 30 glorious ones. Sarcelles, and that's the plan of Sarcelles. That is amazing. La Courneuve is actually the city of 4,000. So a single block has 4,000 people. No, you don't like it? No. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Although I don't know which one came first. I don't know. Okay. So these have been demolished one after another. Last time we went there with students, there was one left, actually. Okay. Okay, so that is France. But of course, there is the Soviet experiment, right? So our contributing author, Daria Bokarnikova, historian of basically modern Soviet Union, shows how after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union had to reckon with Engels' ideas. So all these ideas that actually Juliana explained, which became some sort of like Marxist position par excellence, meaning that architecture is not supposed to solve social problems, right? It's that kind of idea which we call like Engels' ghost somehow haunted Soviet Union the first 3 decades after the revolution, where there was not an immediate rush to construction. But 4 decades after the revolution, after Khrushchev's speech at the Second All-Union Convention of Construction Workers in 1954, mass housing projects were enlisted to build actually existing socialism. So I should just like leave it to you because you know this material better than me, of course. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to steal the Russian material from you.
So what you have on the screen is one of the many, I would say thousands of projects that were produced in the Soviet Union from the 20s onwards all the way to the 1980s. So to give you a sense of the scale, between 1955 and 1970, the Soviet state built 38 million dwellings. Often entire new towns, And you see here an example, one of the early experiments with prefabrication. You see both the plan and a photograph of the buildings. So in our Soviet experts' assessment, and contrary to what we often assume, this was an astonishing success story, uplifting millions of people from poverty and out of overcrowded housing, substandard housing conditions. Here's some more examples. So this policy shift in the Soviet Union, that is this. The Soviet Union is a place where the revolution is supposed to have occurred, right? So according to Engels, all should be right, but in fact, the Soviet Union realized very early on that it's not enough to have a political revolution. You also need to have a tremendously complex and fully functioning apparatus for building and designing these environments. And Daria Bocharnikova really walks us through how these ideas about housing were developed and then put in practice. And her argument, which is quite interesting, is that what ensured the very rapid construction campaign and the spread of the Soviet model to the entire Soviet bloc was not simply the building technology of prefabrication, nor was it this very efficient and rational understanding of the neighborhood unit, a kind of technology of planning. But according to her, what was truly special about the Soviet production was the organization of architectural labor, that is, the way in which architects worked. That occurred in large state agencies, so private firms did not exist. These state agencies in which architects worked in large collectives, hundreds of them together. Agencies sometimes had thousands of architects, employees of the state. And they designed not singular buildings, but rather types that would then be applied with variation at a very large scale and throughout different territories. So the reorganization of the building industry, the scaling up of the production was really mediated through a complete reinvention of what it meant to be an architect. So here are some examples of the Romanian case, which I spent quite some time thinking about. And so this is a diagram of the way in which these neighborhoods would be organized. They are a very early application of what we really like to call multi-zoning today, in the sense that they organized all functions of daily life, including leisure, within the walking distance of the neighborhood unit. So Romania and truly all the countries of the Soviet bloc spent decades building housing at an incredible speed. So to give you a sense, Romania, which only has 10 million inhabitants, throughout the 60s and 70s, was building 150,000 units a year. So this is for a country that is 1/30 of the United States population. And of course, building at that scale required very different understanding of what housing means. And the question for us in the book is, what can really the history of socialism offer to our own contemporary reflection on housing? So these are some more plans of one of these neighborhood units. So the first observation worth making out of this sort of Soviet experiment is that housing does not need the real estate market to exist and to function well. In other words, the provision of housing is not linked in any essential way to buying, selling, speculating, or, as a matter of fact, to owning. large and important episodes in the history of socialist architecture are ones in which the housing provision was almost entirely withdrawn from the market and allocated instead politically and administratively at very low rent. So, by contrast, in the US, we have a polar opposite definition of housing. Housing is that which is eligible for a mortgage from the bank. In reality, it's really the other way around. It is the financial flow that absolutely needs the materiality of housing to exist and to get anchored in the real. So I think that it is critical to raise the question of the relationship to money, to capital, to finance over and over again, because it is at once the most vexing and the most naturalized one. Naturalized in the sense that it is invisible, it seems obvious, it seems entrenched and normalized. The second lesson that we think one can derive is this question between housing as an individual versus a collective project. So this question of scaling up from the individual to the collective or from architecture to the political. So in the United States, homeownership is a highly individualized scenario. There's all these narratives of I can call it my own. There's a whole universe of home improvement and decoration. And architecture really sustains and amplifies the idea of the home as a space of individual expression and fulfillment. Homeownership promotes a scenario of individual advancement and competition. And every single tract home, though identical to others, is sold as customizable. And that makes it very easy to forget that housing is fundamentally a collective, society-wide project. So prices and mortgages and conditions are negotiated individually. Developers are going at it according to their private interests, giving the sense that housing is a domain of individual consumption rather than political participation. And it is true that in many ways housing is the most private of acts, most intimate part of our existence. But I think the book is there to remind us that it is always also collective and political. If there's anything to be learned from looking at the Soviet bloc, is how housing was presented and wielded as a way to raise political and collective consciousness of the inhabitants. So it was really understood as requiring consensus from the entire population. So let's see. So I think John is going to talk to you about the Chinese version of this.
Well, thank you, because Juliana is a world-renowned expert on socialist city and socialist architecture. I never get to talk about socialism, but she very gracefully agreed to let me talk about Chinese communism, so I'm rejoicing it. In China, where Maoist revolution had an anti-urban character, initially few housing projects were built. As our contributing author Sam Liang explains, the Maoist slogan was production first, living second. That's lately the slogan of my students too. Yeah. Well, you can't tell. The meager resources concentrated on the industry rather than on housing. So Liang argues that pursuing anti-urban policies, the Maoist government reinvented the primitive rural dwelling in the new socialist city. And here, of course, primitive should be in quotation marks. This would suggest that the first quote-unquote welfare housing were rural collective work and living spaces in China. So you see here the Ping Fang, the rural work living space with shared basically bathrooms and kitchens. And then there is a more articulate version later called Tongzilu. So Ping Fang and Tongzilu's types were not merely products of basically neglect in their simplicity or the lack of resources due to the privileging of work units, but they acquired later an ideological significance, at least after the fact. So they were associated with Mao's basically ruralist and anti-urban policies. Now, I recognize that welfare, or what welfare meant in communist China, is a major problem here, and we'll return to the problem of translation. But when I asked my friend Sam, and I don't speak Chinese, to try to translate that word for me, he came up with this wonderful Chinese encyclopedia: welfare housing, housing as benefits or in-kind compensation offered to socialist workers, meaning work unit members, not available to public, urban public. Wait, okay, and transitional, temporary, ephemeral, right? So in other words, like you realize that what we say like welfare housing, well, it, yes, translates maybe, but it has a host of different connotations. So minimum existence mass housing research started in China only as the urban forces finally managed to weaken the zeal of Maoism and its ruralist revolution. So these are some of the pictures from Sam Liang. This is the 8 square meter unit, right? And this one is the 15 square meter unit. So, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it bears observing that those beds, and they were meant to, so in other words, 8 people were meant to sleep together in 15 square meters, which is 150 square feet. That's what we're talking about. 150 square feet, 15 square meters. 150 square feet. 150 square feet would accommodate 8 people. 150 square feet. That's what we're looking at. It's 10 by 50. That's right. Sorry, it's 7. 7. And then the smaller one, go back to the smaller one. So this is 8 square meters, which is 80 square feet, which is probably your bathroom, was for 5 people. So we're talking about minimal housing.
Assessing this history as a whole, our contributor Sam Liang comes with a strong argument that the primacy of work unit system in the production of housing in Maoist and post-Maoist China deprived those who didn't have access to work units from social housing, and the disparities from one work unit to the other cause social inequities. He also argues that the state's monopoly in land ownership resulted in the confiscation of land from rural villages in order to subsidize those who are fortunate to be part of work units. In other words, the Chinese case after Mao offers a very serious paradox. A system that is nominally communist has created a privileged middle class, right? So that is a huge contradiction in terms, and we are working with Sam Liang on this argument. Basically, after the ruralist forces were weakened, apparently, during the post-Mao period, then suddenly your access to work living unit, also known as the Chinese welfare unit, became a huge privilege you can basically trade on, right? And then that becomes your eventually your way of just accumulating some wealth and then getting access to the middle class, right? Which is going to be incredibly important in China in the contemporary period. So that is a very, very interesting observation on the part of Sam Liang. All right, so moving on, we are looking at the same period, but then moving rather horizontally to different places. In Algiers, in Morocco, in Casablanca, for example, in Baghdad, in Karachi, in Ankara, in Buenos Aires, either colonial or emerging modern nation states experimented with various housing models exactly at the same time, negotiating the need to provide affordable housing en masse with perceived notions of tradition and modernity. Here you see actually the amazing design by the Greek architect and famous consultant Konstantin Doxiadis for the community in Western Baghdad in 1950s. I believe this is the area that is going to be called later the Sadr city in its later incarnation. But mass housing during this period was hardly understood as a universally applicable solution to the housing question. According to US-based advocates of so-called modernization theory, very influential, large parts of the globe described as the third world lack the capital, industrial organization, and building technology to meet the housing needs of rural migrants arriving in cities in large numbers. So basically in cities and countries with very limited resources and limited industrial organization, but above all limited capital, basically this kind of mass housing was not kind of sustainable. At least that's how they argued. So, and it was inevitable that the squatter settlements would engulf the cities. And they are called, as you know, the favelas, villas miserias, bidonvilles, or gecekondu, whatever you want to call them in different parts of the world. So they came to basically see this kind of so-called informal housing as inevitable economically. And that's interesting because rather than tackling these issues of urban poverty, inequality, marginalization, an emerging class of international development experts describe these settlements as quasi-rural, informal enclaves in the city. They look very favorably upon the self-help housing of the squatters as a means to ease their transition to capitalist modernity, prevent radicalization, very important. If you just like let them build their own houses and occupy land, then they will not turn communist. And neutralize the menace of basically socialism. So although staunchly anti-communist, the modernization theory shared with Engels a streak of historical determinism. The third world nations were expected to go through this very linear path of development leading ultimately to Western-style liberal capitalism, which must be, of course, the final point of arrival for all nations. There are some setbacks lately. Yeah. So the housing policies of the World Bank, as many of you know, they played an incredibly important role in the developing world, which offered funding to the poorest nations, further solidified the bias against subsidized public housing. So World Bank is making a very conscious choice. At some point, they are telling the poorest governments, say like in Africa, saying that if you build public housing, we are going to cut funding, right? So the power of the purse. Instead, in the 1970s, World Bank demanded compliance with sites and services model, which limited the role of the state to providing minimal services to would-be squatters for self-help housing. Here we are fortunate to include new work by two very important, still young but already very important scholars who, since their dissertations, have transformed our understanding of the so-called informal and self-help housing. They trace the work of a group of self-fashioned planetary experts working for developing nations, for the UN, or for the World Bank. So one of them is Helen Geiger, Australian Australian scholar, who studies the work of Jose Luis Sert and Paul Lester Wiener in the small Peruvian city of Chimbote. Their development plan included the design of housing for the workforce of rural-urban migrants, with designs ranging from variants on Sert's patio house to provisional dwellings based on forms of vernacular self-built housing. As Geiger shows in her contribution to our book, the influx of migrants, and I'm quoting, the influx of migrants hopeful for work vastly exceeded projections, resulting in astronomical unplanned urban growth. In an effort to remediate this problem, the city was selected as a key site for trial-aided self-help housing projects funded through the Alliance for Progress in 1960s. So more pictures from Helen Geiger's research in Peru. And again, Helen Geiger's, she provided this image about Wiener and Louis Sert projects with provisional housing. So these are really interesting, quite pioneering experiments in a way. On the other hand, the other scholar that I want to introduce you, in a very provocative new study, our contributor Ijlal Muzaffar argues that architectural histories have completely ignored the problem of land, especially in the colonial and post-colonial territories. He writes, and I quote, "We have talked about space, but not land. We have discussed architecture in the 20th century as if it stood on some given, present, neutral terrain, something readily available and uncontested, something we didn't need to discuss. To a certain extent, this was excusable in the European and American context. Here, the institutions that were presumed to secure land as property were actually present at the turn of the century, be it the state acquiring land through eminent domain or turning one form of tenure into another. But the myopia has been acuter, more consequential, when the projects discussed were in the decolonizing sphere. Here, the role of the architecture was not only to provide an object, but to legitimize a new set of institutions, from those securing dictatorships to international development. Here, land was not given. Architecture served as a medium to secure, anchor the legal and epistemological contours of the land that such projects were to stand on." And he continues, and I should stop there. So this was Ijlat Muzaffar that I quoted. So what follows is an extraordinary account of the work of the British architects Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. You see one of their buildings on the left. For the British colonial government in West Africa, in Ghana, Togo, and Upper Volta of Nigeria. They've written a book, Village Housing in the Tropics, which became the handbook of British colonial officers. Muzaffar argues that the village housing played a role in preparing West Africa for decolonization and for the so-called indirect rule. Okay. So village housing, Muzaffar argues, introduced land in Africa as a transitional space, something in between communal and property. Actually, my friend Ijlal has a talent for writing English as if it's German, so he creates these compound new neologisms. And my favorite here is that he says that their architecture is somewhere between no longer communal, not yet property. I mean, we need these words in our dictionary, no? No longer communal, not yet property. So this is aligned with Muzaffar and a number of young scholars' greater project of showing how the production of housing in the so-called Third World amounted to introducing the indigenous residents into Western financial capitalism. Self-help housing promoted by international organizations, as much as mortgages and instruments managing financial risk, treated residents as transitioning from a tribal family into a modern middle-class family. The labor-intensive transitional quality of the self-help and the core housing reflected basically this transition. So in other words, like this argument that's being formulated at least since Ijlal Muzaffar wrote his dissertation at MIT a few years back, and now also picked up by many other scholars, is the following, that basically all these institutions like World Bank, they were basically working on basically providing these labor-intensive models as a way of slowly introducing people to Western-style capitalism. And for example, it's a very interesting detail here that self-help housing was invented by American architects in Puerto Rico. Actually, even before that, it was organized in the American South, but in both places, labor was not cheap enough, right? So it's something that's invented for the American South, but which would not be useful because it's an industrialized country, would be basically promoted in the Third World, because what else these people will do rather than for a lifetime constantly build their own house rather than someone else building for themselves. Okay. All right, so Shannon, you'll be surprised about that because my colleague Shannon Starkey, sitting here, because one really fun aspect of superimposing architectural contexts that are so different from one another in this book is to discover unlikely correspondences, if not similarities. So I'm included actually here work from my colleague Shannon Starkey's research in California City. I think it's strange if I were to introduce your work to you, no? Do you want to say a few things? I wanted to show these pictures, my favorites. Is this the church in the California desert, Mojave Desert? Yes. And then that is California City. Do you want to say a few words? Or?
Sure. I don't need a mic,
You're fine. Yeah.
Yes? Yes. Okay. Sure, so I guess, in a book primarily about socialist and communist housing, I offer...
You're going to feedback right in front of us.
Is that better? Something that was happening in the US, so this is California City, this is the artificial lake constructed at California City. From the basically late 1950s through the early 1970s, when the entire operation was shut down by the federal government and the Attorney General, the developer, Nathan Mendelsohn, acquired close to 200 square miles of desert north of LA, and then hired a number of architects, Smith and Williams, followed by Conrad Wachsman, and then Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, to create basically a very compelling architectural imaginary that was used to sell land. And so it occurred to me as Juliana was mentioning that where Engels is on one side saying that architecture does not matter and that it's a kind of social political project that needs to occur, and with modern architects on the other side saying architecture can be the solution. I think in California City, what we see is a kind of alignment between a social political project by Mendelssohn through the establishment of community service districts and a kind of fake democratic government, and an architectural imaginary, all in the service of selling a deed. So how that works is a kind of closed loop system that Mendelssohn creates, whereby his employees are selling land that they also purchase and become owners. And then they start a kind of incorporated town where they elect themselves to run the town, but all the while working for the developer. So his will remains intact. And from basically the 50s until the early 70s, there were close to a little over 50,000 landowners that generated a little over $100 million in revenue over about a 17-year period. Until, like I mentioned, the Attorney General stepped in and charges of fraud and misrepresentation were brought against the developer, and the whole operation kind of collapsed almost overnight. And Mendelssohn ultimately sold the development as it was on the decline to a larger conglomerate, which tried to revive it, but ultimately sold it themselves. And today, California City, at the time it was shut down, California City had a little over 50,000 landowners, but only about 800 residents, nearly all of whom were employees of the company. Today, it has slowly acquired some residents, so there's about 14,000 people living here. Although, remember that it's now about 250 square miles, so it's the third largest city in California after Los Angeles and San Diego.
Where is it exactly? Where is it?
About 100 miles north of LA.
On the coast or in the?
No, in the desert, so very close to Edwards Air Force Base. Yeah. So you can imagine, 250 square miles, a kind of smattering of homes spread across that, occupied by around 14,000 people. And most of the land now it has reverted back to the city because people just stopped paying the taxes on it.
So there's some buys, you can get some buys out there.
Oh yeah, sorry.
There are some investment opportunities.
There are. So every 5 to 10 years, a new kind of maverick person tries to redevelop this area. Of course, it always is failures. So California City is the kind of endless failure, but also the endless dream of development in the desert.
That's great, thank you. All right, so I realize that introducing this book to you will take a very long time, so I will be quickly wrapping up. But very quickly, in the 1970s and 80s, the tide turned against public housing, and architectural historians too contributed to what amounted to an emerging orthodoxy of neoliberalism. The formal periodization of Western architectural history by so-called postmodern theorists equated modern architecture with public housing and declared an end to both, as in Charles Jenk's reading of The Destruction of Brute Ego in St. Louis. Today in North America and Europe, now including the former Soviet bloc, the decaying housing districts continue to be equated with the failed policies of the welfare state, socialism, or modernist utopia. The myth that social housing was imposed by a small cadre of modernist architects on good American people, right? This is actually almost literally a quote from Robert Venturi, by the way, where it had nothing to do with the indigenous notions of community, remains basically a conventional wisdom that publics continue to rely upon. The supposed alternative American suburb is often associated with the naturalized values of home ownership, self-reliance, and individuation. Too quick to dismiss modernist towers and blocks as a transparent vessel of a foreign ideology, the critics of public housing have been blind to the ways suburban districts of tract houses, too, have been sanctioned by the modern state. And of course, new light was cast on the issue in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, when the US federal government intervened in housing markets in decisive ways by socializing not housing, but instruments of financial risk that sustain the housing market. In large parts of Asia, Middle East, and Latin America, in contrast, the housing question is being asked with a new sense of urgency. The informal squatter districts are being replaced with mass housing projects in geographies that extend from Brazil, Algeria, Turkey, and China. Architects are called upon once more to work for national housing authorities or for large enterprises, whereas architecture as an altered practice is being marginalized. So I wanted to show you some of the extraordinary transformations of the city of Istanbul and metropolitan region, but I have to go rather quickly. So in this area, in the Western Corridor, according to my colleague Emrah Altınok, in a matter of years, couple of years, a new city the size of Zurich will be built. Okay, to conclude, basically, recently some of our contributing authors were in San Diego for an authors workshop with us. And then a number of interesting questions emerged as we were sitting around the table. One is basically the issue of preservation. What is to be preserved? What happens when housing projects are seen as architectural heritage, the heritage of modernism that needs to be kept for the later generations? This is the case especially in France today, who are really on the forefront of this. I mean, that they look at their housing projects and then they don't see a social question, but they see beautiful architecture. So, Nate, this is the moment when there is a copyrighted image that we'll have to take out from the video. It's because we couldn't obtain the permission from the photographer. But it's also a picture that really wonderfully captures during these recent renovations and restorations of housing units. I mean, what is to be preserved, really? Building form, building history, or the residents' lived history? This is the question that our contributors from France, architecture professors Sandra Parviu and sociologist and historian Alice Soccia are raising about the ongoing preservation of housing plans in France. Because literally the government of France is coming to these housing sections and declaring some of them national monuments, where people are living in it. Right? So there are, of course, paradoxes, because these blocks were understood to be utilitarian answers to a social question. They were architecture without quality when they were taught. They become architecture at the very moment they are detached from their social function. So these are the pictures of my colleagues, contributors, Sandra Parviu and Alice Soccia, about the recent projects for preservation but also renovation of the housing blocks in France, which is, I would say, one of the number one interesting public commissions in the country at the moment. So in other words, in their work, Parviu and Soccia argue that the preservation replicates some of the hierarchies of the French society, which designated housing projects for the subaltern populations, and now is reclaiming some of these projects as artistic national heritage. And the second concern with which I want to finish today is the issue of translation, or what is lost in translation. I don't know why they are two. I was busy this morning. We talked about fully fanged, right? All these things that Sam Liang is telling us might mean in Chinese, and they may not be able to be translated into English fully. In Turkish, I came up with, for example, Gecekondu Önleme Bölgesi. Gecekondu is built overnight, zone for the prevention of the built overnight. No, doesn't sound like it. But if you think that the Chinese fully fang and Turkish Gecekondu is kind of strange in English, then now think about what people in China and Turkey were to think if you were to explain to them California's housing element law. Like, try, imagine yourself in front of a Chinese or Turkish public and say that, housing element law is all about affordable housing, but what we need to do is that, well, basically, because we don't want the government to build it for us, then we basically write 50 pages, single space legislation that micromanages every section of local land use on the state level. After we come up with inventories of basically taking these things to Sacramento, in Sacramento's housing and community development certifies every single lot, and then comes back to you, and then the entire thing has no enforcement power. Meaning that if the city ignores the state can't sue them, but then private developers can sue the city. This is, by the way, from research of my student Kay Wong, who's there. The city can be sued by private developers for lost opportunity. Well, trying to explain this from someone from China, and they will think that you are mad, right? Because if you need affordable housing, why don't you build affordable housing? Okay. So, but basically, what interests me in this project is it is lost in translation. We are not interested in creating a global history with a new master narrative, like how housing has been in the globe, because that would mean translating everything into our language. But we are also interested in things like that. This is from my friend and colleague Kıvanç Kılınç work in Izmir. This is basically a housing project built in the early 1970s in Ege Mahallesi by the municipal authority, especially for the Roma people. That's why there's no example like that, but because they were taught to be, and the municipal discourse is fascinating and kind of problematic, because they thought of the Roma as free people, therefore they can't be natives in training into capitalism. We need to build them a different typology. There's no such thing like that anywhere else in the world, I believe, but therefore, because of its strangeness, it's worth studying. All right, thank you very much. Do you have that? So Juliana will be happy to take questions.
I think I missed something, but you talk about all the housing developments in socialized countries with the absence of any discussion of elements like a green or Pruitt-Egan, except at the very end. Why the absence of the capitalist countries' housing?
Well, Shannon was wrong. This is not just about socialist and communist projects. We actually have we ran out of time, but there's definitely, there's at least 2 American projects in the book. And I would strongly argue that all the projects that were financed and run by the World Bank in third world countries like Peru, Togo, Ghana, are very much capitalist projects.
Like Belgium, Netherlands,
and
France. Yeah.
The Western European welfare state is also very much embedded in a capitalist worldview. It just has a different understanding of the role of the government. but these are environments of free market.
I worked on some of those projects like in Ghana, and that's the question: is what is the alternative?
What is the alternative?
You're absolutely right, or your author is writing. No, I'm not sure where he's going with the argument. The general perspective was a capitalist Western perspective that what was missing in these countries was a land market and a financial market, and the bank came in either to help with the financial market development, which is what I was doing, or the land market development, and sort of an intermediate temporary fix, in a way, was the sort of the core housing on self-help housing, as you described it. And does your author come with an alternative to that in that environment of the 1970s and 80s and 90s?
Right. I don't think that he does, and it's a historical project. So rather than basically a project of being able to offer an alternative, but even between, I think, Helen Geiger and Ijlal Muzaffar's approach to, say, Peru versus Ghana, I think there's a bit of difference of approach, right? It comes across as, it seems that basically Ijlal is very interested in institutions of global governance. And she is a lot more interested in locality, what was happening. But to answer your question, I mean, you can ask the same question about California's housing crisis. I wish I knew the answer about how we could solve it, right? But
well, there isn't a solution there. I mean, in the sense, from my point of view, if the market is squeezing out through the public by restricting access to land, the public, you have a very good point about trying to explain this.
Yeah.
Because it goes back to governments. It actually, what it does is it goes back to your very first comment, what struck me, your comment, that, well, the rest of the world calls it the state, and in the U.S. we call it the government. But those two words, coming back to your comment, imply very different things.
Right.
You probably recognize that.
Right.
In the rest of the world where they use the state, that's sort of like an independent actor that's out there, has a will of its own, authority of its own. It does things to people. And in the U.S., in theory at least, we don't have that. We have a government that responds to the people. It's responsible to the people. We change it at will, as we have done recently. And so that's a very different concept. We don't have the concept of, like in Europe, of the state as being an independent actor. And that's because of that we have the complication that you can't explain to someone where, oh, the local folks say, no, we don't really want anything over 5 stories. We really don't want this development here. That's a foreign concept. In Germany, all land is, there's very tight controls over where you can build, how you can build, and everything from the top down. And we have this sort of from the bottom up environment that's almost impossible to explain. And as a result of that, combined with geographical and financial restrictions, we have the housing crisis, and on the other hand, we don't have any easy solution other than 50 pages of single space. That's ignored.
Right.
Well, I want to respond really briefly because I think these are very important observations. You are right that there is a gap between state and government, and one can see it as top-down, bottom-up. One can also see the difference as the government being a set of regulations and enforcing those regulations, versus the state, which is yes, it can be authoritarian and it can be top-down, but it is also a moment of forced consensus across the entire society. So I think what the book shows, because it has a comparative framework, it shows that there are alternatives, right? So when you put Ghana next to Peru, next to Czechoslovakia, it sort of breaks down the sense that there are no solutions, or that was the only possible solution, or that a certain solution is the natural one, right? It shows that, in fact, there's a variety of ways in which societies have come up, small societies like local government and large societies like the Soviet bloc have come up with solutions, right? And I think one of the things that is often lost when we talk about housing today, and especially I think in the American context, is that this is going to be solved through some kind of consensus. There has to be consensus. And in a consensus, there are people who will disagree, right? So it's not, if you break it down at a very small scale, it's just the neighbors who have to weigh in, or it's just a local municipality that has to can exert authority or will represent the will of the people. The problem remains very fragmented, and it's the real difficulty is to scale these things up to the level in which we are all implicated in the solution, right? That by all, I mean the American state, the Europeans, right, at that level. And that's where architects offer an easy cop-out, because the promise is that we can individualize solutions endlessly. And I think what we're saying is that it's not about individualizing solutions, it's about forcing that very difficult moment of political and social consensus.
But consensus in this country is always harder to find because we're less homogeneous. All those countries, as you very astutely said, there's a consensus that undergirds the state. But they're homogeneous society, relatively homogeneous, both economically, ethnically, whether it's Romania or Germany or Ghana has more tribal issues. But America is simply more fragmented, and it's getting more so in terms of the non-homogeneity, so therefore the difficulty of reaching consensus is getting sort of exponentially difficult.
You had a question? Yeah.
Well, sort of building on the same conversation, I just came from the American Planning Association conference, which was held here in San Diego last week. And the housing issue in California just permeated the entire conference. And so I was going to ask you from your research, what can you offer to California, but you discounted that as one of your outcomes. I would hope that you look at it, but I really liked the comment that say back to the housing element, which is kind of useless exercise, it does force localities to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that would be observation number one. And observation number two, the free market, which we rely upon for our housing, isn't working because it is only going where there is profit, and there is no profit in affordable housing. Not only that, it takes some sort of subsidy, and we are unwilling as a society to provide subsidies. So the whole system that we relied upon since the end of World War II is collapsing. So I guess my question is, what can be built? We know what's not working. You seem to have some insight into what has worked. How do we meld those to go forward?
Well, I think just the observation that affordable housing is in many ways antithetical to speculative real estate mechanisms. I think that's a profound observation, and I think we have to grapple with that. I mean, only recently have we started talking about universal health care in this country. Why couldn't housing be also conceived of in those terms, right? And that's why I think what we are saying is less a solution and more of an angle that indeed it is as much about a political solution than an architectural one.
I want to add, though, that the origins of the housing element in 1967, they are progressive, right? I mean, because it's fair share housing in California, it's basically trying to prevent wealthy, suburban communities to shut themselves out of housing. So the intentions were and still are very good. But then it becomes an extraordinary process, and it's not bottom up at all. It's quite top down at the same time, because the housing and community development in California, in Sacramento, they have a very major role, right? But it's worth thinking why it hasn't worked in producing the affordable housing, right? That Juliana is talking about, right? So that's an important question to ask.
Well, I think the other thing that's lost in the housing situation in California and elsewhere in America is that there was a lot of government subsidy in the post-World War II suburbanization effort, but that's completely written out of the conversation. And then even a lot of those things that were subsidizing that have, they've been discredited or they've just collapsed. For example, our highway infrastructure, nobody wants to support keeping it going. So we're letting our bridges and our highways fall apart. That got us out to the suburbs to begin with. A lot of our plumbing, our water supply, all of those infrastructure investments that allowed that to happen as a public-private partnership is collapsing. So that there doesn't seem to be any consensus on that as a model either. This is getting depressing.
Yes.
You have been explaining here about the big scale of the housing of the building. Have you researched about the small scale? I mean, it's like, have you researched if architecture answer to the family chain that we have since the 70s, 60s or 70s? I mean, so we don't have the typical family anymore. It's like now we have today a couple live in a house, then we have 1 or 2 kids. 5 years later, maybe they divorce, one of the person will stay in the house. 5 years later, one of the kids go to the university, then the grandma goes to live with them, then they marry with another person, then they rent in Airbnb, so there is like all that kind of changes, but our house is the same one. The layout of the house is the same one since the 60s or 70s, like kitchen, living room, I don't know how many bedrooms, how many bedrooms. There is only a few architects who have been researching with that growing or expandable or pop-up houses. You saw us the case of like Adona Basal, also Sigerban. So have you researched that small scale in your book, on your research?
Do you want to take on that? No, that's an excellent question. It sounds like you have already the beginnings of a brief of an architectural design studio. That sounds really, really exciting. I mean, it has been quite central in the discussions when we come around the table, and then the experts of so many different places, from capitalist countries to former socialists to third world countries. It came up quite a lot because, and especially quite a bit about the so-called developing country context, because if you basically support the self-help housing, then you are assuming that there will be some sort of a patriarchal organization, a unit called a family, and they are going to be all like residents and laborers of their own house, right? So this kind of model, without necessarily realizing I don't think that was the goal, end up by basically imposing on some formal structures a different kind of type of family, right? And of course there were experiments in the socialist bloc about complete communal living, but it didn't go very far.
Yeah, so if anything, I think we're hoping to introduce precisely that kind of micro texture to this category of mass housing, right? And I think you could get from the pictures that there is a huge difference between the 8 square meter Pingfang in China to the which was actually a form of collective living for workers outside family bonds, to the type that was implemented in Ghana, which also had a normative project of breaking down tribal kinship and promoting the nuclear family, a very Western model of a nuclear family of parents and children. So housing always comes with these kinds of assumptions about the family structure, the modes of domestic life, and those assumptions vary tremendously throughout. So in other words, if anything, it's very hard to make a single category of mass housing because indeed when you go to the micro scale, very different projects are at stake.
I was going to raise the question of architects in all this. And I thought it was very interesting what you said, that the communist or Russian model was architects are just clerks in an agency. Their imagination, their creativity is completely gone. And yet in the U.S. model, we built these giant public housing projects that have been demolished because they were bad to begin with and they didn't work. So where do you go from here? Is the architect the solution, or is it somebody else that's the solution?
I don't think I ever said that creativity was gone. I just said that the mode of production in an architectural firm was very different in the sense that they worked collaboratively. It's very hard to trace lines of authorship. There isn't like a signature author because the project is not to produce a building that is original and singular and represents the extraordinary vision and talent of an architect, but it is meant to solve the problem of a large group of people. So it's done by the group, for the group. And the idea that the architect's personality should be taken into account, it's actually seen as a distortion of the process. So yes, there's a assumption there, right? And we can agree or disagree with that vision, but it's certainly not about curtailing creativity. It's about harnessing the powers of design, which is understood to be much closer to a scientific model of production and a management of production, in order to solve a problem that is on a massive scale. Right? So the individuality of the architect is not only irrelevant but not very useful in this case.
What I was getting at though was that the result was monolithic developments over many square miles, and there was no sense of community because everything looked alike. And so
and if I may, I think that's also where we're coming in and saying that is also not true, because these developments were meant to be communities, and there was a lot of infrastructure and shared public space and parks and playground structures and commercial and leisure structure. They were not seen, they were not meant as mechanisms of alienation, but really as mechanisms of bringing together. And I think that is actually a misreading of both the intention and the outcome.
Wow, there are many more questions. Yes, please.
How can you explain the walk-to-work culture when you talk about mass housing? So we see all houses, but we don't see work there. So how do you explain that mass housing in relation to work? Because work is everyday life. How do we deal with that?
Right. Well, in this particular Chinese example, work and living was in the same place, it turns out. But you're asking about the relationship, like between.
What would your idea or opinion about when we produce these mass housing and where there is no work around, just housing? Then we are giving more problems than just creating a housing. So
Right.
how do you?
Right. Do you know the answer to that?
Sure. I mean, they were placed in the city around industrial centers very often. So they are often built out of the needs of the large-scale production. They are always understood in terms of what we would call today centers of employment. And they were also, actually maybe this is an interesting parenthesis, but they were also always understood in terms of public transportation To give the example of the car, and maybe to go back to this question of the individual versus the masses, these societies were meant to function around public transportation, and they understood the existence of cars quite well. The big difference is that the car was not meant to be individually owned. So there was a very early project in the 50s in which there would be a park of cars that would be collectively owned and rented, very much like the Zipcar model today, and that people could take public transportation, take taxis. Taxis were seen as transportation for the people, or rent a car for whatever need they had. So it's not that they don't want cars, it's not that they don't want that technology, it's just that that's the mode of ownership was not meant to be one person, one car that we have today, right? And therefore, and that transforms the way we think about cities, because if you don't have one person, one car, then the mode of circulation is entirely different, right?
To just add to that, one person, one car, but the transportation also does not, like in most of the cities, transportation is also a major issue, where you cannot travel for, the distance is too big or too, that's why you need your personal car. So what would be your response when the public transportation is not so well designed to reach to your workplace? So,
I have no, it's not about assessing success and failure. I am with you that many of these have failed in very different ways. It's really about recovering the initial project and thinking, what was so we think of these things retrospectively as they have failed and therefore they ought to be discarded. The task of the historian is really to reconsider them in their own terms, in the way in which they were conceived at the time, with their ideals and their ambitions and their aspirations. And that's what we're trying to recover here. We're not saying we have to build the socialism as housing or the sites and services
I
model.
talk about the third world, by the way.
This is not the project at all. It's about recovering the validity of that project at that time.
Do we have time for another question?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Just an observation, when you look at housing, architecture, etc., really you're looking at a historical basis, and you're looking at an equation that brings into account the variables of the economies, the materials, the infrastructure available at the time, what is creating that need for an architectural form. And so in San Diego, for example, when the growth here was based initially on horse and buggy, and then on the electric cars, the electric trolley system throughout the city, based on the idea that people will build where it's cheap for them to have transportation to go to and from. And so here, you're looking at now in the world, the economies of, well, can we repurpose what has been built into another format to meet the needs of today and not necessarily the needs of tomorrow? So just as an observation.
And because you are raising such an important point, that let me very quickly try to address that. Basically, today in California or in the US, when we talk about housing, very few people think of architecture. Mortgages come to mind, like mortgage securities and I don't know, like bundled like mortgages and sliced and derivatives, and also regulation comes to mind, right? Governance, of course, comes to mind because housing is governance. Economics comes to mind, and to a non-architect, when you go and say that, well, housing is architecture, it comes as a surprise, right? Because architecture is maybe, at most, will just like govern the building code for like building height, right? So, of course, this is a historical project, but what I am hoping that if architects read a project like that, maybe they can take the power back in trying to tell to the general public that the architect can really do something, right? I mean, starting with architectural solutions to problems, knowing about history, might have actually some utility. Oh, okay. Yes. Oh. Yeah.
But there's no consideration of the idea of co-housing, which was developed in Scandinavia,
Cool.
and it's a whole different concept.
Yeah.
Actually, Kimberly Zaricourt talks about Sweden quite extensively.
So
We didn't cover
We
everything.
introduced 1/3 of the projects. So in the next 2 hours, we'll go.
Just real quick, in terms of the transportation to go with the affordable housing, I just don't know if everybody knows that MTS voted this week. Do they have some large park and ride lots with their transit, and they voted to allow them to build, they're gonna build affordable housing on that at those transit stops. So I think that's a really good sign for the city.
Yes.
Well, I think we should all buy this book next year, so.
Thank you.
We have to, I think we ought to have an autographing session next year when it comes out, and we can speak about it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here are makers
thank
of modern
you.
architecture of all things. They need some
Thank you.
architecture in
That's
this
great.
discussion.
You're very kind. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks
Thank
for
you so
coming.
much.
Thank you for your questions.